Grendale, Vermont, population 1,946. By the summer of 1972, the last of the vines had overtaken the East Dormitory at Elmsworth Boarding School. The windows, long shattered, were choked with wild ivy. Floors sagged, doors swollen with rot hung from rusted hinges. It had been nearly 3 years since the school's quiet, unceremonious closure. Most locals assumed the buildings would be levelled. Some hoped they would be repurposed, but nothing happened. On June 14th of that year, a contractor named Jeremy Ellis was sent to inspect the dorms ahead of an insurance auction. Ellis, then 42, was not from Grendale. He'd driven in from Keene and brought with him a clipboard, 2 assistants, and a camera. They began in the West Wing, checking staircases and floorboards. Then they moved to the condemned structure east of the Central Chapel, a building once reserved for first-year girls. In room 2B, while prying loose a warped cedar panel near the closet, Ellis's assistant uncovered something jammed between the slats. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, sealed in an old Zippo tin. The tin was scratched, but still dry inside. The graphite on the page had not faded. There was no name. The note read, "I tried to leave, but they found out. Tell my mother I didn't forget her." Below the last sentence, a faint date, April 2nd, 1959. The letter was handed to Grendale's sheriff, who forwarded it to the county's child protection services. But no case was opened. The dorms were soon scheduled for demolition. The note was filed away under unattributed finding, no follow-up required. That would have been the end of it, if not for an archivist named Helena Parrish. Parrish had been hired part-time by the Vermont Department of Historical Property to preserve artifacts from educational institutions that no longer operated. She came across the letter in 1973 while reviewing sheriff records. What struck her wasn't the handwriting, it was the date. According to Elmsworth's official records, no child had gone missing in 1959. But by cross-referencing scanned student attendance sheets, she found a discrepancy. A name appeared on the March attendance log for Elmsworth's Form 2A dormitory. Clara E. Braith, age 14. The name was gone by April. There was no disciplinary report, no withdrawal form, no record of transfer. She had not graduated, she had not failed. She had simply ceased to exist in the system. Parrish contacted the remaining members of the Elmsworth Administrative Board, but received only one reply, a brief note from former Registrar Milton Kay. His message read, "To my knowledge, no such student existed in the final register. Possibly a clerical misentry. We had several of those. The spring of '59 was unusually chaotic. No interviews, no further correspondence." What made Elmsworth unique among Vermont boarding schools wasn't its curriculum. In fact, its academic rigor was average by most contemporary standards. What set it apart was its isolation. Situated on 112 acres of fenced, wooded property outside Grendale, it was often called a silent school. Students were discouraged from speaking during meals, transitions, or unsupervised free time. Letters home were censored for content. Visitors were allowed only during designated days once per quarter and were restricted to the main atrium. For over 5 decades, Elmsworth cultivated a reputation for strictness and social refinement. Its alumni included minor politicians, lawyers, and one opera composer. But the school's motto, Disciplina, Discretio, Ordo, was more than decorative. Discipline, discretion, and order weren't just taught, they were enforced. The East Dormitory, where Clara Braith's note was found, had always held the youngest cohort of students, mostly girls between the ages of 12 and 15. In interviews conducted by Parrish with former students, that wing was often described as too quiet. One alumna, Beatrice Northrup, who attended from 1958 to 1961, recalled, "I remember there were empty beds. Some were made up, but no one slept in them. And we weren't allowed to ask why. If you did, they called you to the study room. You never wanted to go to the study room." When asked about Clara Braith, Northrup didn't recognise the name. But when shown the letter, she grew pale and reportedly said, "I remember someone crying in the vents that April. But we were told, it was the pipes. In 1974, the remains of Elmsworth were finally levelled. The entire East Dormitory was bulldozed, and most of the site cleared for a nature preserve. But Parrish, by then convinced of a larger cover-up, kept copies of her findings. She interviewed over 24 former students between 1973 and 1977. Their accounts varied in clarity, but many circled the same unease, a fear of asking too much. One student described being given a handbook upon arrival that warned against the sin of exaggeration. Another, a boy named Thomas Duval, recounted how students were sometimes sent to meditation rooms for days without explanation. Duval said, "There were doors without knobs. You'd be walked in and they'd close behind you. Lights stayed on the whole time. You'd hear someone pacing outside. You were supposed to reflect, but I always wondered, were they testing something?" When asked what he meant, he hesitated before adding, "They wrote things down while you were in there. I could hear the pages turning." None of the rooms Duval described appeared in the official campus blueprints Parrish obtained from the state. No mention of them existed in the promotional brochures or donation reports. But in a 1960 invoice submitted to the Vermont Board of Education for facility upgrades, there's a line item labelled simply, "Psych Evaluation Chambers, Sub-Basement, Ventilation Add-on." The amount? San Naitu. The idea that Clara Braith simply ran away was the easiest to accept, that she slipped out one night, evading staff, and left behind only a letter. But several details in Parrish's research complicate that theory. First, the note was dated April 2nd, a Thursday. Elmsworth operated under a locked campus protocol during all weekdays. No student could leave the grounds without a signed faculty escort. Even the gate to the tree-lined exit was padlocked and only accessible via internal key, held by a single night staffer. Second, Clara's bunk remained occupied in the daily bed check logs for 2 more weeks. Her signature continued to appear, faint, strangely consistent, on meal rosters. Then abruptly, the entries stop. A handwriting specialist, when shown the signatures decades later, determined that the last 4 entries attributed to Clara were likely forgeries. The looped B in Braith's name was slightly off. The angle of the lowercase r suggested a different hand. This implies that not only did someone continue marking her present, they deliberately wanted it to appear as if she'd never left at all. Grendale's local paper, the Vermont Morning Tribune, ran no missing person story that spring. In fact, in the entire year of 1959, there is not a single documented disappearance in the public record from Elmsworth. This isn't unusual for a school of its size, but what is unusual is that 2 other student names, Margot Sims and Evelyn Yarber, also appear inconsistently across attendance logs that same semester. Yarber's final dorm record ends in mid-March. Sims disappears after April 10th. Parrish found no graduation photos for either girl. Their names do not appear in the 1960 alumni registry. When she contacted the Vermont Department of Education for further files, she was informed that a fire in 1971 destroyed most legacy paper records from the 1950s. No digital archives exist. The agency claimed it had no additional information. Yet a single microfilm reel, discovered in 1981 at the Grendale Public Library, contained a copy of Elmsworth's internal newsletter, the Bell Notes, from May 1959. In it was a single photograph captioned Dorm 2 Spring Study Group. 8 students are pictured, 7 are named. 1, a dark-haired girl in the back row, has her name obscured by ink smudge. The girl bears a striking resemblance to Clara Braith. The ink used appears darker than the print tone of the rest of the image, suggesting it was applied later, possibly by hand. In 1982, Helena Parrish formally submitted her findings to the Vermont Commission on Historical Integrity. Her report spanned 112 pages and included photocopied dorm logs, photographs, interview transcripts, and a copy of the handwritten letter discovered in 1972. The Commission declined to open an inquiry. Their statement read, While the material presented is compelling in tone, it lacks sufficient legal corroboration to justify an investigation into a defunct institution. The closure of Elmsworth Boarding School was properly documented and finalised in accordance with state standards. But not long after, Parrish received a phone call, not from the Commission, but from a woman named Judith Ayers. Ayers was the granddaughter of Elmsworth's head groundskeeper from 1955 to 1962, Edgar Ayers. She claimed to have found something among his belongings after his death. It was a leather-bound field notebook with several entries spanning nearly a decade. Most were mundane: furnace checks, vehicle fuel logs, weather notes. But toward the back of the book, beginning in the spring of 1959, the entries became erratic. Short sentences, unexplained codes, names. One page simply read, 3 from East, 2 quiet, 1 screaming, night run. They said she was relocated. A week later, another entry. Don't go into shaft alone. Screaming echoes, not wind. Parrish followed up with Ayers in person. She photographed the entire notebook. Then she asked Judith if her grandfather had ever spoken about Elmsworth before he died. Judith nodded. He said that place changed after '58. He'd stop outside the chapel and just listen, like he was trying to figure out if something was still moving inside. The chapel. It stood at the centre of the Elmsworth campus, a circular stone building with a single wooden steeple and no stained glass. According to school records, it was used for weekly assemblies and holiday events, but alumni memories conflicted with this sanitised version. Several students described the chapel as off-limits, except during instruction. It was, by most accounts, deeply unpopular with the children. The air inside was reportedly bitter cold, even in spring. A faculty member's journal from 1961 noted that students often emerged from chapel visits subdued and more compliant. This was considered a positive outcome. What Parrish discovered next would never be accepted into the official record. One of the alumni she interviewed, a man named Dale Harmon, was 73 years old at the time of their meeting. Harmon had been a kitchen assistant at Elmsworth from 1957 to 1960. In a taped conversation, he told Parrish something he said he had never told a soul. I saw her, the girl, just once. She was running through the yard behind the dorms. They were chasing her, not the staff, but the older girls, like dogs on a leash. Her hands were bleeding. She was barefoot. They dragged her into the chapel through the basement door. We weren't supposed to know it existed. Parrish pressed him, asked if he knew who the girl was. He shook his head. They said she was sick, that she needed containment. That was the word they used, containment. But she didn't look sick. She looked terrified. In 1991, nearly 2 decades after her first discovery, Parrish compiled her findings into a privately printed document titled The Elmsworth Disappearance File. Only 50 copies were made. Most were sent to historical societies, journalists, and academic contacts. One reached a small radio host in Portland, Maine, who aired a late-night segment summarizing the theory. The backlash was immediate. Former faculty wrote letters calling it defamatory fiction. A retired headmistress claimed Parrish had faked the documents. The Vermont Department of Archives refused to validate any of the material, citing a lack of original paper trails. Several copies of the report were removed from shelves by request. Parrish was asked to stop presenting her theory as verified history, but she never recanted. Until her death in 2004, she maintained that the disappearance of Clara Braith, and possibly others, was real, deliberate, and part of a broader institutional pattern of psychological conditioning. She believed Elmsworth was used to test isolation thresholds in children, that the school's silence wasn't a disciplinary method, but an experimental variable. Her claim was dismissed as conspiratorial. Still, there are fragments. In 2006, a documentary team attempted to shoot footage on the overgrown grounds where Elmsworth once stood. The chapel had long since collapsed, but partial foundation stones remained. Beneath a layer of moss and soil, the team uncovered a rusted doorframe leading to what appeared to be a sealed underground space. Due to structural instability, entry was not attempted. The footage was never aired, but the production notes, which later leaked, described an anomalous find. Just inside the threshold of the chapel's remains, they found a row of heavy iron hooks bolted into the stone floor, at intervals of 5 feet. No one could explain what they were used for. The team returned the next day with lighting equipment, but the entrance had already been resealed by local authorities. No permit had been filed, no explanation given. One more detail remains. In 2019, a woman named Abigail Cross reached out to a small online forum dedicated to unsolved archival mysteries. She claimed that while cleaning her recently deceased aunt's attic, she found a wooden box containing keepsakes from her aunt's childhood at Elmsworth. Among them was a photograph of 9 girls in uniform, dated 1959. Most are smiling, arms draped around one another, but in the lower right corner, a girl is standing slightly apart. Her arms are crossed, her face is shadowed. Unlike the others, she is not smiling. Her gaze is distant, focused elsewhere. On the back of the photograph, written in a different hand than the rest of the box's contents, was one sentence. She tried to tell someone. They took her before she could. The girl matches yearbook sketches of Clara Braith, the ones believed to have been drawn from memory by her former bunkmate. The photograph was sent to a private researcher. Image comparison placed the probability of a match at over 87%. Still, authorities declined to reopen any investigation. No evidence of criminal activity was found. What makes the story of Clara Braith so chilling isn't that she disappeared. Children go missing, records get lost, bureaucracies fail. What's terrifying is how many systems had to stay silent for it to work. A missing girl who was still signed in at breakfast, a teacher who saw her vanish into a chapel, a janitor who wrote warnings in code, a school whose records burned in a fire no one witnessed, and a file, sealed in a sheriff's drawer, labelled "No follow-up required." The Elmsworth Boarding School no longer stands, but the story it left behind has not eroded with the wood or stone. There are gaps in the records, names that no longer appear, photographs with faces too blurry to identify, and a single note, unsigned and untraceable, sealed in a tin beneath a wall. I tried to leave, but they found out. Tell my mother I didn't forget her. It was the last thing Clara Braith ever wrote, and the first crack in a history that was never supposed to be remembered. Autumn 1953, Grendale, Vermont. Elmsworth Boarding School was entering its 31st year of continuous operation. By this time, the routines were unshakable. Wake-up bells at 5:30 a.m, chapel silence until 7. Students moved through the halls in synchronized lines. Breakfast was taken in fixed posture. Laughter, questions, even sideways glances were quietly discouraged, often by a subtle press of a faculty member's hand against a child's shoulder. But in October of that year, a rumour began circulating among the Form 1 and Form 2 students, those aged 12 to 14. It had nothing to do with the cafeteria food or stolen dormitory keys. It was about a hallway, specifically a corridor on the second floor of the North Academic Wing. A stretch of rooms students called the Gallery. Officially, the gallery had been decommissioned in 1946. It had once served as an art and drafting wing, but had been sealed following a supposed roof leak and mould problem. Faculty said it was off-limits due to unsecured materials and unstable floors. It remained listed on no current student maps, but the hallway still existed, behind a narrow stairwell rarely monitored after evening hours. A few students, on a dare or out of boredom, made their way up there, and that's when the behaviour began to change. By late October, 4 students, 2 boys and 2 girls, were formally disciplined for unauthorised elevation movement. In Elmsworth's coded language, this referred to any incident involving stairwells leading to restricted wings, but the consequences were oddly severe. All 4 were reportedly confined to solitary dormitories for a minimum of 10 days. No explanation was shared with the general student population. No names were mentioned during morning roll call. Their belongings were removed from shared spaces. One bed in the girls' dorm was stripped entirely and never reassigned. And then there was Elliot Macabre. Macabre, age 13, was considered one of the school's more promising entrants. His academic files described him as precise, obedient, and unlikely to question authority. But according to student testimony collected years later, Elliot had gone up to the gallery alone. It was a Saturday evening. Lights out had passed. His bunkmate, Richard Lewis, recalled Elliot whispering that he just wanted to see if it was real. He took a flashlight and disappeared. He returned an hour later, but he wouldn't speak. Not that night, not the next, not for the remainder of the semester. According to Lewis, Elliot lay in bed, awake for hours, blinking at the ceiling, clutching his pillow. On the 3rd night, he began drawing symbols on the underside of his bed frame with the charcoal from his art set. On the 6th night, he stood barefoot in front of the dorm mirror, whispering strange words, slow rhythmic syllables, in a language no one recognized. Elliot Macabre's parents arrived the following week. He was officially withdrawn due to acute dormitory stress disorder. The phrase, rare for the time, appears in only 2 other student files from Elmsworth's 1950s record logs. Neither student was ever publicly accounted for again. Macabre's family moved to upstate New York within the month. His sister, 20 years later, would describe a detail that still disturbed her. He would stand in front of the mirror for 20 minutes at a time, not blinking. Then he'd whisper things, always the same phrases, sometimes in Latin, sometimes I didn't recognize the language at all. I caught him once writing on the back of his closet door, all capital letters, repeated over and over, "Silent is safe." He never told me what it meant. Elliot was institutionalized briefly in 1954 at St. Raphael's Sanitarium outside Albany. He was released 2 years later under the care of a private family facility. He never returned to school. He never spoke again about Elmsworth. While most written records from the 1953-54 school year focus on disciplinary logs and dormitory incident reports, something else began surfacing in the staff journals. Indirect mentions of administrative reads, "The second floor matter is being handled internally. I'm not to mention it in any parent correspondence. Dr. Hentley said he'd reorganized the group. Not sure what that means." Strange silence among the girls in Dorm B. No laughter for days. A separate journal from maintenance supervisor Gerald Trask includes this cryptic line from November 7th. "They want the locks changed again. North wing, 3rd time this term. No instructions for why. Doors still warped from moisture, but someone's using them." In 1971, decades later, these journals were found stacked in a box labelled "Obsolete, do not archive." They were recovered by a custodian assigned to prepare the West Faculty Hall for demolition. The custodian kept them out of curiosity, later passing them on to local historian Eileen Maris. Her attempt to publish excerpts was denied by the Vermont Department of Historical Preservation due to incomplete verification. But Maris noticed something else in the entries. Between October and December 1953, staff references to a particular designation increased. Group 8, that term, Group 8, does not appear in any official Elmsworth paperwork. The school listed only 7 form groups for organisational purposes, correlating with student age and academic year. Group 1 represented incoming 12-year-olds. Group 7 comprised graduating 17-year-olds. No 8th group was ever printed on schedules, seating charts, or graduation programs. Yet in the personal journals of 3 separate faculty members, Group 8 appears 17 times in one semester alone. Sometimes it's attached to meal schedules, G8 to East dining, staggered arrival. Other times it's buried in behaviour reports, G8 intake notes missing, report to registrar. Most chilling of all was a scribbled note at the margin of Dean Hentley's December journal. The G8 girl won't sleep, says she hears the others in the gallery, says they want her to draw it. There are no names listed with Group 8, no pictures, no grades, just fragments, comments, and an absence where there should have been faces. In 1994, a box of miscellaneous Elmsworth materials was anonymously donated to the Grendale Historical Trust. Most of it was ordinary, typed student rosters, old maintenance receipts, and holiday programs from the 1940s. But tucked inside the bottom of the box was a stack of 12 sketchbook pages. The paper was stained, torn along the edges, and unsigned. On each page, a drawing of a hallway, always the same hallway, always from a different perspective. One showed a long corridor ending in a narrow arch, the floor patterned in mismatched tiles. Another depicted a line of doorways, but each door bore no handle, only a vertical strip of black where a knob should be. In the centre of the sixth sketch, a small figure, crouched low in the middle of the hall, hands over ears. A note had been clipped to the stack, typed on old carbon paper. It read, "Found in desk dorm B, belongs to G8, don't log." The handwriting on the back of the pages, shaky, ink bleeding through, repeated a single phrase, "The second floor is not for sleeping." What becomes clear, looking back, is that the term Group 8 was never intended for the general student body. It functioned as a kind of shadow classification, reserved for children who had either broken specific rules or displayed what faculty referred to as non-conforming cognition. In practical terms, this meant that in the transcript that reads, "The subject will not stop describing the second floor. Erasure recommended." Group 8 never existed, officially, but they were there. They are what the school was built around. Not a program, not a failure, a design, a machine. And for over 20 years, that machine ran in perfect silence. Until it didn't. Winter break 1964. Elmsworth Boarding School stood empty, officially. Classes had ended the previous Friday. Students were returned to their families by train or private hire. Dormitories were sealed. Heat was cut to minimal levels. The entire campus entered its cold season standby phase, a standard protocol enforced each December and lifted only 2 days before spring term. But on the evening of December the 23rd, a janitor named Lowell Mears, hired for interim maintenance during the break, made an unscheduled visit to the main office building. Mears was no stranger to Elmsworth's rituals. He had worked on and off at the school since 1952. A quiet man, he knew the routines, the quirks of the buildings, the sounds of the old pipes. But what he saw that night unsettled him enough to write a formal complaint to the Grendale Facility Oversight Committee. The complaint, filed in blue ink on lined notebook paper, was never officially processed, but it was preserved in a file box labelled Janitorial Non-Essential, discovered in 1986 during a records transfer. It reads, "At 10:40 p.m. I passed by the registrar's office in admin wing and saw a boy inside. Lights were on. He stood facing the wall, thought it was a student left behind. Door was locked, no response when I knocked. Tried again, 5 minutes later, room was dark, empty, no exit sound, no open window. I checked the handle, still locked. No investigation followed, no student was reported missing. The office logbook listed no access after December 20th. The name of the boy, if one existed, was never recorded. 2 decades later, in the spring of 1983, a new staff nurse at Elmsworth, Marianne Carr, inherited a box of old supplies from her aunt, who had worked at the school in the 1970s. Inside the box were bandages, record books, a broken stethoscope, and, sealed beneath a false cardboard floor, a manila envelope. The label read, "Property of Group 8, do not file." Carr opened the envelope. Inside were 16 pages of student documents. Most were incomplete. A few bore only single lines, name, age, room number. But 6 sheets stood out. They were handwritten assessment forms, neatly structured, pre-formatted with standardized psychological fields. All were unsigned. Each had a name at the top. One name appeared twice, Isaac J. The form labelled Second Assessment included fields that did not align with any known educational or psychological standards of the time. Among the categories, obedience response level, somatic reversion, linguistic mirror compliance, psychological bleed. Each checkbox had been marked using a tightly sharpened pencil. Every category, except for one, had been selected as intensified. The final note on the form read, "Subject repeats chapel phrase in sleep. No external prompt. Conditioning appears successful." Who was Isaac J? No full surname was included. The standard Elmsworth student lists from 1963 to 1965 show no student with that name or initial. No yearbook photo matches. And yet the document's details, dorm location, class grouping, date, all match the winter 1964 term. Durant, the journalist who had unearthed Group 8's shadow history, believed this was the first documented link between Elmsworth's administrative body and a child used not for correction, but for experimentation. Isaac had not been reprimanded. He had been observed, measured, manipulated, and not in the classroom, in an office, during break, when no one was supposed to be there. The layout of the registrar's office, in 1964, included a secondary anteroom, a back chamber originally designed for storage. According to Elmsworth's internal architectural map, the room had been retrofitted in 1958 for private evaluation and record handling. It contained a single desk, 2 chairs, and a bolted drawer built into the wall. Carr's aunt, in one of her old memos, referred to the space with unease. "It's cold in that room, always colder than the hallway, and the lights buzz. I don't like being in there with the door shut. They used to keep the Group 8 files in that drawer, but it's always locked now." Durant later interviewed a former administrative aide who recalled that during the 1960s, only 2 people held keys to the registrar's anteroom, the headmaster and Dr. Salwin, the campus wellness specialist. Dr. Harold Salwin was not a licensed psychologist. His background, according to personnel records, was listed as Human Development and Institutional Systems. He held no clinical certification, yet dozens of memos from 1960 to 1965 list him as the primary evaluator for students assigned to non-standard dorm rotation. Among his notes, recovered from his estate in 1997, one entry bears the date December 22, 1964. It reads, "Subject, Isaac J. isolated for auditory analysis. Shows response to unvoiced prompts. May be appropriate for repeated sequence initiation. Administered second passive cycle. Left in registrar for 18-hour observation." No mention of parental consent, no supervision logs, no outcome noted. By the time Elmsworth closed in 1974, the registrar building had been stripped of all internal file cabinets. During a demolition audit, state contractors discovered that one of the walls in the former anteroom had been double insulated, not for temperature control, but for sound. The drywall showed signs of later modification. Microphones had been installed, wired through to a junction box located 2 rooms away, behind a false bookshelf. This configuration does not appear in any building plans. No permit was filed. Inside the junction box, they found 3 reels of magnetic tape. All were blank, erased, but lab testing confirmed they had once held audio. What was recorded and why remains unknown. In 2005, Durant interviewed another former Elmsworth nurse. She asked her what she remembered about Isaac. The woman didn't respond at first. Then she said, "I remember a boy who didn't blink, that's all. He was small, thin, always watching the door, but he didn't talk to the other children. I thought he was new, but he was already in the system. I saw his name only once, on a folded form. Group 8 was written in red pencil at the top. I asked where he slept. They said, 'He doesn't sleep here.' That phrase would appear again, years later, typed in block letters across the margin of a housing rotation chart. Isaac J. does not sleep here. But the logs suggest otherwise. He was moved 3 times in 1 semester. Each dorm placement lasted less than 10 days. At one point, he was listed under Nocturnal Study, Room 5N, a room that doesn't appear on any map, but shows up on a heating invoice from January 1965, billed under Off-Cycle Isolation Zone. No temperature was recorded for that unit, only the note, Heat Disabled by Request. In 2012, the existence of subject Isaac J. took a disturbing turn. While reviewing a collection of discarded academic reports acquired from a private estate sale in upstate Vermont, a researcher named Gwen Halpern discovered a carbon copy discipline form that was never processed. Its official title was Phase Shift Behavioral Violation, Group 8, Individual Report. The form was marked as Session 2, Post-Evaluation. One paragraph, typed and initialed by a name too faded to recover, reads, Subject responded prematurely during auditory recall cycle. Recited conditioning phrase at incorrect interval. Corrective protocol initiated. Minor bleeding from auditory canal noted. Cause unconfirmed. Reverted to silent state within 5 minutes. Will reinitiate testing during winter cycle when dormitories are vacant. The phrase when dormitories are vacant was underlined twice. What this strongly suggested, and what Durant argued publicly in her 2015 paper, An Engine for Silence, was that Isaac wasn't simply left behind by mistake over the Christmas break. He was placed there, alone, inside the registrar's anteroom, to be monitored without interference. Whatever conditioning Elmsworth had been perfecting, it worked best when the building was empty. The chapel phrase mentioned in Isaac's second assessment appears in 4 other documents from the Group 8 files. The line was never quoted in full, but partial fragments surfaced. We are not seen, because we do not speak. The bell does not toll for the quiet. Under the stairs behind the names. Durant believed these were part of a mnemonic recitation drilled into the children as a test of compliance, or worse, as an obedience loop. The repetition of specific language, often tied to disorientation, is a known technique in cultic isolation therapy and early behavioral modification studies from the 1950s and 60s. What makes Elmsworth's usage so disturbing is that there was no academic justification, no published research, no therapeutic context. There was only secrecy and silence, and a child left behind with no bed, no guardian, and a pencil-thin form labelled subject. The deeper horror becomes apparent when you look at what wasn't filed. The envelope Carr found in the 1980s, the one labelled Do Not File, had originally been slotted between the pages of an unused medical logbook. A book that, by policy, should have been submitted monthly to the school nurse's office. It wasn't. Instead, someone hid it. That book, faded green canvas, worn binding, was later tested for trace materials. Lab results revealed faint chemical residue in the creases of the paper. Not ink, not mold, but lithium chloride, a compound known for its use in experimental mood suppression and neurological dampening, often tested on institutional patients in mid-century pharmaceutical trials. There is no record of any licensed medical professional administering lithium at Elmsworth. No prescription logs, no treatment justifications, and yet the residue was there, in a hidden medical file, containing notes on a child marked for auditory conditioning. In 2016, one final piece emerged. A maintenance worker, assigned to monitor the demolition of a state-owned storage facility outside Brattleboro, discovered an unmarked cabinet filled with reel-to-reel tape recordings. Most were damaged or blank, but one, labelled Room J 12-2464, was intact. It lasted exactly 13 minutes. The first 8 were silent. Then faintly, a voice, a child's, male, calm, repeating, in steady rhythm, "The bell does not toll for the quiet. The bell does not toll for the quiet. The bell does not..." A pause, the faint knock, footsteps. Then a different voice, older, male. "Subject Isaac, continue, do not delay." The boy speaks again, louder now. "We are not seen because we do not speak. We are not seen." Another pause. The tape ends with a mechanical click. No further context, no timestamp, no date confirmation, except that the box it was stored in had the same winter 1964 facility code as Elmsworth's registrar building. Durant authenticated the tape. It remains archived in a locked repository housed in the Vermont Office of Historical Audio Preservation. It is labelled Unverified Experimental Material, Discontinued Institution. What makes this chapter so horrifying is not the cruelty, it's the bureaucracy. There was no malice in the handwriting, no screams in the forms, no blood on the floor. There were pencils, checklists, doors locked from the inside, and a child told not to speak unless prompted. In Isaac's case, there was no classroom, only an anteroom with microphones, and no intention of returning him to the dorms. He was not punished, he was not forgotten, he was used. Elmsworth did not simply educate, it extracted from silence, from repetition, from fear. What they wanted from Isaac, whether obedience, imitation, or erasure, they almost achieved. Almost, because he was seen. Once, through the glass of a registrar's office window, by a janitor who stopped walking, a boy standing still, facing the wall, no movement, no noise, until he was gone, and the room was empty again. The registrar's building was demolished in 1975. The tapes were erased. The papers marked "Do Not File" were scattered. But the memory of that boy remains, not because of what he said, but because of what was done to ensure no one ever asked where he went. No grave and no graduation and no family visit, only a name without a surname, a form without a signature, and a hallway where the heat was turned off, by request. March 1967. By this point, the institution known as Elmsworth Boarding School had perfected the art of vanishing. Not of people, though there were many of those, but of time. The spring semester that year is remembered not for what happened, but for what was erased. The official Elmsworth yearbook for 1967 contains only 42 pages. Prior years averaged over 90. There are no class photographs from the spring term, no mention of student awards, no notations of graduation prep, sports rankings, or academic rankings. Only a single grainy photo, the school chapel half obscured in fog. Captioned, March Reflection, no students in frame, no date. The registrar's archive, now held in a secure state facility, is missing all enrolment confirmations for the spring semester. When the Oversight Board was asked to provide attendance logs for that term, they delivered a single page, a carbon-copied disciplinary record dated March 12th, the heading blacked out. Only 3 lines are legible. 2 removed, 1 silent, chapel closed indefinitely. Reschedule, Group 8 rotation. That was the only surviving document. Faculty interviews conducted decades later described the spring of 1967 with hesitation. Margaret Tolland, a former Elmsworth language instructor, said this during a taped interview in 1994. It was strange, we had students leave mid-term. No goodbye, no ceremony. Their beds were cleared overnight. A girl, Anne Morris I think, just didn't come to class. When I asked, the headmaster told me, we're rebalancing the schedule. Another staff member, who declined to be named, recalled an emergency faculty meeting held the week before Easter. We were told to discontinue chapel services and to remove all art supplies from the girls' dorms. No reason, just reduce stimulation. That was the term. And Dr. Salwin? He didn't show his face after March 15th. Salwin, the school's so-called wellness specialist, left Elmsworth in April. No forwarding address was provided. His personal notes from that period were never recovered. 2 injuries were logged during the blackout term. Both involved upper year boys. One was hospitalized with a fractured wrist, an orbital fracture, after an incident during evening prayer. The official report called it a hallway fall. The other was sent home early after reportedly experiencing what the staff called disruptive sleep cycles. His parents, when interviewed in 2002, described it differently. He He stopped sleeping entirely. He was drawing at all hours, the same thing over and over, a staircase with no bottom, and under each one, in tiny letters, the same words, not alone, not alone, not alone. Neither boy returned to school. Their medical files were redacted in full, but what came next couldn't be contained by forged rosters or sealed buildings. Between 1968 and 1973, 5 former Elmsworth students, all enrolled during the spring of 1967, were admitted to regional psychiatric facilities across New England. Their diagnoses varied: dissociative behaviour, compulsive sketching, catatonia. But their symptoms aligned too closely to ignore. Each experienced intermittent blackouts. Each developed a compulsion to draw in closed spaces, stairwells, corridors, windowless rooms. And each, when sedated, repeated the same phrase: Elmsworth never ends. This line appeared in 3 separate patient logs. One physician, Dr. Leland Cray, later testified in a closed session of the Vermont Psychiatric Review Board that he believed the phrase was part of a shared traumatic mnemonic, something implanted, not developed. In lay terms, they hadn't imagined it, they had remembered it together. One patient, 15-year-old Eleanor West, was admitted in 1971 after a psychotic episode triggered during a fire drill at her new school. While in care, she produced over 200 pages of automatic writing. None were coherent essays. Instead, they consisted of repeated words, disconnected phrases, and what her caretakers described as preservation scribbling. At the centre of nearly every page, a bell, sometimes labelled Old Chapel, sometimes It Rings Below. Eleanor did not speak aloud for the remainder of her life. She died in 1989 under state care. Her drawings remain archived in a restricted collection labelled Undiagnosed Post-Institutional Response, Case Cluster E. The phrase Elmsworth never ends is not metaphorical, it is logistical. Analysis of the school's scheduling records, those not destroyed, shows that during the blackout term, dormitory and class assignments were repeatedly overwritten with alternate configurations. One such log, recovered from a damaged faculty ledger, shows names shifted daily, sometimes hourly, between dorms, study halls, even basement rooms. In the margin, a staff member scrawled, "We're looping again. They're seeing each other too often. Control the pattern or dissolve it." Durant, the journalist who uncovered the Group 8 framework, called this the moment Elmsworth's internal system failed. Not because someone resisted, but because the machine outpaced its own design. Too many moving parts, too many erased names, too many children who had been rotated so many times they no longer responded to structure. There were no lessons left, only reactions. One death occurred during the blackout term. The report listed it as an off-site accident. A student, boy, unnamed, allegedly struck by a delivery vehicle near the gate. No witnesses, no citation issued, no funeral held. The death certificate lists Elmsworth Boarding School as the notifying institution. But according to town records, no ambulance was ever dispatched to that address on the date in question. A private nurse, who had resigned shortly after, said this in a letter written years later. They said he wandered, that he disobeyed the new map, but he didn't wander. He saw something he shouldn't. He went to the old dorms, the second floor. That's why they pulled him from chapel duty. His name was never published. His bed was reassigned. No alumni list includes him. What Elmsworth tried to create during those weeks, in those corridors, was not order. It was an illusion. A machine built on shifting placements, behavioural suppression, and silence. But by spring of 1967, the silence began to echo. The children spoke in drawings. They wrote phrases no one had taught, but for those who were there, the blackout term marked the moment something irreparable broke. Not a scandal, not a rebellion, not a cover-up, a collapse. Elmsworth didn't lose control. It used up what little control it had, and when it failed, it chose to vanish. Not in smoke or fire, but in paper. No photos, no awards, no names, only a silence that still rings, quietly, beneath the chapel that no longer stands. In October of 1971, the Vermont Office of Child Welfare approved a statewide inspection schedule for all privately funded youth institutions. Elmsworth Boarding School appeared on that list for the first time in nearly a decade. The visit was to be unannounced. A team of 4, 2 inspectors, 1 child psychologist, and a medical officer were assigned to arrive on November 3rd. They never did. Official documents show the inspection was postponed indefinitely due to clerical oversight. But a deeper look into the correspondence between the state office and Elmsworth's administration tells a different story. A letter sent by Assistant Administrator Randall Price, dated October 30th, references a full alignment of facilities and personnel in anticipation of external presence. It concludes with the phrase, "All files undergoing review will be resolved before week's end." That week, every student was kept inside their dormitories. Scheduled lessons were cancelled. 2 halls were locked outright, Holloway East and the lower wing of Laurel House. Maintenance reports from that month note sealant procedures used on door frames and temporary deactivation of alarm systems. One entry, scribbled in pen by a facility manager whose name has been redacted, simply reads, "Burn pit behind chapel, ready by Thursday." In a taped interview from 1982, former groundskeeper Walter Densley recalled that week. He said he was asked to dispose of a large stack of boxes containing paper records and cloth bundles. When he asked what they were, he was told they were outdated files. That night, he poured gasoline over them and lit a match. What struck him, he said, wasn't the heat or the smoke, but the smell. "Not wood, not paper, something else, sir," he said. "Something awful." Within 48 hours of the scheduled inspection, a complete rotation of staff took place. Of the 22 employees on Elmsworth's payroll that month, 6 disappeared from employment records entirely. No termination notices, no resignations. Their last listed date of payment is November 1st, 1971. Among them was Nurse Evelyn Cardenas. Unlike the others, Cardenas did not leave quietly. Weeks after the inspection was cancelled, she submitted a report, typed, unsigned, and sent anonymously to the Office of Child Welfare. The letter has since been partially declassified. Its language is clinical, but the emotion beneath is unmistakable. In the letter, she describes being told to vacate her station by midday on November 2nd. She refused, citing medical oversight obligations. Her request was denied. She remained at her post in the South Infirmary wing of Holloway House. That night, sometime after 2 a.m, Cardenas awoke to what she described as a child's voice, very soft, singing. She rose from her cot and checked the room. No patients were logged in that wing, no visitors authorized. Yet the voice continued, off-key, slow, repeating the same 3 lines of what she believed was a lullaby. She followed it. Through the darkened corridor, down the central hall where the emergency lights flickered intermittently. The voice grew quieter as she approached the sealed hallway of Holloway East. Then it stopped. She wrote that she stood there in silence for nearly 10 minutes. The floor beneath her smelled of bleach. The air was warm, unnaturally so. She turned to leave, but as she did, she heard a breath, not hers, a single exhale, from just behind the locked door. There was no response when she called out, no footsteps, no movement, just one final sound, the creak of a chair being slowly rocked back and forth. Cardenas finished her report with a single sentence, typed on a separate page. That voice didn't want to be found. But it never left. In late October of 1971, the Vermont Office of Child Welfare scheduled an unannounced inspection of Elmsworth Boarding School. It never happened. On record, the reason was a clerical error. The visit was marked as postponed indefinitely, just 3 days before the scheduled arrival of state inspectors. But internal memos, later uncovered in litigation, reveal that Elmsworth was warned in advance. They prepared quickly. According to facility logs, a facility realignment protocol began 48 hours before the inspection date. Dormitories were evacuated, students were confined to their rooms. 2 entire halls, Holloway East and the lower wing of Laurel House, were sealed without explanation. Personnel records show something even stranger. Of the 22 listed staff members, 6 vanished from payroll without notice. No resignations, no terminations, just a date, November 1st. Among those names was Evelyn Cardenas, a night nurse. But Evelyn didn't leave, not exactly. Weeks later, an unsigned report was delivered to the Office of Child Welfare. It bore her writing style. It described in clinical detail what she experienced after refusing to vacate her station. She heard singing, a lullaby, soft and broken, coming from a supposedly empty dormitory. She followed the voice through unlit corridors toward the sealed Holloway wing. The singing faded, the singing silence, and then breathing, a child's breath, shallow, rhythmic, just beyond the locked door. No one was registered there. No records exist of any student assigned to that hall. Yet Cardenas heard the creak of a wooden chair, slow, deliberate, rocking back and forth. She never returned to work. Her report ended with one line, typed in isolation on the final page. That voice didn't want to be found, but it never left. It was taken in the spring of 1973, a wide-angle photo on the south lawn of Elmsworth Boarding School. 42 students, 6 staff, a line of boxwoods behind them, trimmed and orderly. Everyone is facing the camera, most are smiling. There was no formal note of the occasion in school records, no photographer credited, but the image was archived in a newsletter draft discovered during the school's closure review. Its file name, finalspringcohort.tif. At first glance, it looks like any end-of-year photograph. The children wear the same navy uniforms, the same tightly knotted ties. Their posture is identical, arms locked at the sides, eyes forward. But the names don't match. Of the 42 students in the photo, only 17 appear in the 1973 Elmsworth enrollment log. The rest are unlisted. No names, no files, no records of transfer or expulsion. They simply do not exist. Not on paper. It wasn't until 1987 that a digital archivist working on a forgotten education history project noticed something else. Using early facial recognition overlays, they tried matching the unidentified children with known alumni photos. The software flagged anomalies. 14 of the students had faces that were nearly identical, not in the sense of twins, not even siblings, but precise copies with only minuscule variations, a tilt of the chin, a parting of the hair, a blink caught mid-frame. The archivist annotated them template clones, suggesting at first a crude attempt at collage tampering, but the negatives were real. The original print, unearthed from a forgotten filing cabinet at the Vermont School District Archives, showed no signs of manipulation. The film was intact, no overlays, no composites. The duplication was photographic, it was physical. Then came the tape. In 1998, a freelance journalist in Middlebury reported finding a shoebox of unlabeled cassettes in his late uncle's attic. The uncle, Roger Dilling, had worked for a short time as an education compliance officer during the early 70s. One of the cassettes was marked in blue pen, E73. The audio begins with the rustling of grass, then a voice, female, sharp, measured. "All right, class, stand tall, shoulders lines, you know them." And then the chant begins, flat, toneless, repetitive. The same phrase repeated in unison, though the actual words are indecipherable. Not English, not Latin. Something phonetic with a rhythmic structure. The most disturbing element isn't what is said, but how it's said, as though it is one voice, looped over itself. Not 40 children, one speaker, echoed 20 times. An audio spectrogram analysis conducted in 14 confirmed it. The waveform reveals identical pitch, tone, and breath pattern. There was no chorus, there was no group, just one vocal imprint, multiplied. The journalist who recovered the tape never published the full audio. According to his notes, the recording ends with the sound of the camera shutter, followed by 3 seconds of silence. Then, a child's voice, singular and trembling, whispering the words. They weren't supposed to be in it. The voice doesn't match any of the previous chant patterns. It is believed to be only authentic child voice on the tape. That photograph now sits in the Elmsworth archive at the Vermont State Historical Society, but digital copies circulate on niche forums, most often accompanied by red circles around certain faces, pointing out inconsistencies. 3 children with the same left dimple, another set with identical shoelace patterns, 2 with mirrored collar folds. But the real terror isn't visual, it's conceptual. By 1973, Elmsworth was no longer hiding individual abuses, it was concealing something structural. The photo is not evidence of who disappeared, but of what replaced them. Whatever process had overtaken the institution, it was not accidental. It was administered, rehearsed, repeated. What makes this moment the climax of the Elmsworth story is not that it provides closure. It does not. It provides exposure. The unveiling of a ritual that was no longer human in purpose or outcome. No further photographs were ever taken on school grounds. And in the final enrollment list dated June 1974, only 11 names remain. 3 of them belong to children who appear twice in the photograph. Elmsworth officially ceased operations in the spring of 1974. The closure was unceremonious. No public statement, no alumni newsletter, just a line in a state education board memo dated May 12th. Elmsworth Boarding School will discontinue services due to financial strain and revised academic policy standards. The building sat vacant for nearly 2 years. Weeds crept up the stone columns. Window panes shattered under frost. Vandals left little graffiti, only silence. It was as if the town preferred to forget the place existed. In 1976, the remaining structures were bulldozed. No salvaging, no historical preservation. The land was left to overgrowth. But the silence didn't last. In 1983, a rural postal worker named Ellis Merrin, operating a route 62 miles from the original Elmsworth grounds, began receiving a curious set of letters. Every Friday, without fail, an envelope would arrive, always addressed in careful, looping cursive to Elmsworth School, Vermont. All were postmarked from different small towns across the northeastern US, and each bore the same interior, a blank sheet, save for one line, handwritten, always in what looked like a child's script. We're still learning. The handwriting changed, the ink changed, the towns changed, but the sentence did not. Merrin submitted the letters to the Postal Fraud Division in Montpelier. Investigators attempted to trace return addresses. Not one matched a known residence, school, or public facility. Most were variations of streets that didn't exist, zip codes that belonged to vacant fields, or homes destroyed decades earlier. By 1985, over 70 letters had been received. None bore a signature, none ever stopped coming. Attempts to connect with former students of Elmsworth yielded little. Survivors were few. Those who could be found refused interviews, often hanging up or closing their doors without a word. Some had changed their names entirely. Others were marked as deceased, some by suicide, others disappeared. What lingers is not only what happened, but what remains. The documentary ends where it began, with a recovered letter found hidden inside the wall of the registrar's office during demolition. The full note, until now kept from public view, is read in quiet narration. They line us up and count differently now. There are numbers that don't belong to us. They say we'll be the last, but the last of what? We don't speak at night anymore. We only listen. They say listening is safer. The writer was never identified, but it is this line, the last of what, that stays with you. Because even in ruins, Elmsworth wasn't just a place where something terrible occurred. It was a place where something was built. And if it was built once, silently, institutionally, and without record, it could be built again. And maybe, somewhere, it already has been.